I always believed that art was like breathing, something you did naturally, without thinking about it, until someone told you to stop. Until my son handed me a tablet on my 71st birthday and said the words that would change everything. Mom, it's time to join the modern world. Sitting here in the tiny corner of my kitchen where I've painted for the past 15 years, surrounded by canvases David and Linda consider worthless clutter, I realize what I've believed for 30 years was completely wrong. I thought family meant supporting each other's dreams. I was mistaken. The morning light filters through my small apartment window, just like it did 47 years ago in the art studio where I met James. Back then, my easel caught the eastern sun perfectly, and I could lose myself for hours in the way shadows shifted across my canvas. Now, I paint between the refrigerator and the kitchen table, squeezing watercolors from tubes I've learned to make last months instead of weeks. I used to have a proper studio. James built it for me in our first house, converting the sunroom into a space filled with natural light and possibility. That was before the accident, before 4 children became my sole responsibility, before survival became more important than self-expression. I sold that house 23 years ago when the mortgage became impossible to manage alone. The irony wasn't lost on me that David, now a successful real estate developer, had suggested I sell. He was 22 then, fresh from college with big dreams and bigger opinions about what his mother should do with her life. Even then, he looked at my paintings the way people look at outdated appliances. Functional once, but ready for replacement. This morning feels different, though I can't pinpoint why. Maybe it's the way the light hits the small canvas I started yesterday. Maybe it's the letter that arrived 3 days ago, the one I've read 17 times but haven't had the courage to answer. Sarah Martinez, one of my former students from Lincoln High School, somehow tracked me down after all these years. She wants to include my work in a retrospective exhibition featuring local artists from the 1980s and 90s. I haven't told David about the letter. Experience has taught me that sharing my artistic hopes with my family leads to well-meaning suggestions about more practical uses of my time, like the tablet. Like the senior center activities Linda researches for me, craft circles and book clubs that she insists would be more social than painting alone in my kitchen. The tablet sits unopened on my counter, a sleek reminder of my family's love wrapped in their complete misunderstanding of who I am. David spent 20 minutes explaining its features, his voice carrying that patient tone I recognize from his conversations with his teenage twins. The digital art program, he assured me, would be so much easier than mixing paints and dealing with brushes. No mess, no storage problems, no canvases taking up space in my already crowded apartment. I try to imagine James's reaction to that suggestion and find myself smiling despite everything. He would have laughed, not mockingly, but with the gentle humor of someone who understood that art isn't about convenience. The phone rings, pulling me from my memories. It's Linda, her cheerful voice carrying the underlying efficiency that makes her such a successful interior designer. She wants to know if I've tried the tablet yet, and whether I'm available this afternoon for what she calls a little organizing session. I've learned to translate Linda's language over the years. Organizing sessions mean throwing away things she considers clutter. Little means it will take several hours. Available means I don't really have a choice in the matter. I find myself agreeing, as I always do, while mentally cataloging the paintings stacked against my bedroom wall. 37 canvases from the past 5 years alone, plus dozens more stored in the small garage space David allows me to rent from him at a family discount. Each painting represents hours of work, moments of discovery, small victories over the limitations of age and circumstance. To Linda, they represent dust-collecting obstacles to a cleaner, more organized lifestyle. After hanging up, I return to yesterday's painting, a street scene from my neighborhood where morning light transforms ordinary brick buildings into something magical. My hands move automatically, mixing the perfect shade of amber to catch the sunlight on window. This is meditation for me, this dance between color and light, between what I see and what I feel about what I see. I painted this same street 20 years ago, and again, 10 years ago. Each version captures not just the changing neighborhood, but my changing relationship with light, with color, with the act of seeing itself. Linda would call this repetitive. She doesn't understand that an artist returns to the same subject the way a musician practices scales, not because they're stuck, but because each return reveals new depths. The mail arrives early, and I hear the familiar thud of packages in the lobby. Probably another delivery for the young couple upstairs, who seem to receive something every day. I remember when getting mail meant letters from friends, invitations to gallery openings, submissions to art magazines. Now it's mostly medical bills and advertisements for things I neither need nor want. But today, there's something different. A thick envelope with my name written in careful script. The return address makes my heart skip. Riverside Community Gallery. Sarah Martinez actually followed through. Inside, I find an official invitation to participate in Forgotten Voices, Local Artists Rediscovered, along with a form requesting information about available pieces and artistic background. The exhibition opens in 6 weeks. They want 12 to 15 pieces, preferably work that represents my artistic evolution over the past decades. I have work, more than enough work. The question is whether I have the courage to say yes, to put my paintings in front of strangers who might see them the way Linda sees them. Outdated, amateur, embarrassing. I set the invitation next to the unopened tablet and return to my painting. The morning light is shifting now, changing the entire mood of the street scene. I add a few strokes of cooler blue to the shadows, watching how it makes the warm light seem even more golden by contrast. This is what David doesn't understand about art. It's not about the final product, but about the process of discovery, the conversation between intention and surprise. At 65, I thought my painting days were winding down. James had been gone 12 years by then. The children were established in their own lives, and I was settling into the quiet rhythm of retirement. I painted for myself then, smaller canvases that fit in my downsized apartment. But somewhere around 70, something shifted. Maybe it was the awareness that time was becoming more precious, or maybe it was finally having enough distance from my child-rearing years to remember who I was before I became someone's mother. My paintings grew bolder, more experimental. I started working larger again, pushing myself to capture not just what I saw, but what I felt about what I saw. The doorbell interrupts my thoughts. Through the peephole, I see Linda's perfectly styled blonde hair and David's familiar silhouette. They're 3 hours early, armed with boxes, and that determined expression I recognize from previous organizing sessions. I open the door to Linda's bright smile and David's distracted nod. He's already looking past me toward the paintings stacked against the hallway wall, and I can see him calculating square footage, imagining the space without my clutter. Linda moves through my apartment like a general surveying a battlefield. Her trained eye catalogs everything that doesn't meet her standards of clean, modern living. The stack of art books on my coffee table, the easel folded in the corner, the small table covered with paint tubes, brushes, and sketches. All evidence of a life lived differently than she would choose. She pauses at my latest painting, still wet on its easel, and I watch her face carefully. There's a moment, just a brief moment, when I see something like recognition flicker across her features. Then it's gone, replaced by her usual polite smile. David finds what he's looking for in my bedroom. The paintings leaning against the wall, 37 windows into my world over the past 5 years. He lifts the corner of one canvas, and I see his expression shift from mild interest to barely concealed impatience. They've come to help me, they explain, to make my life easier, more manageable. The paintings are taking up too much space, creating dust and clutter that makes my apartment feel cramped and disorganized. The solution is simple. Donate them to charity where they might bring someone joy, or dispose of them if they're beyond salvaging. The tablet will give me unlimited creative options without any of the storage problems. As they explain their plan, I feel something I haven't felt in years. The clear, sharp knowledge that this moment will define everything that comes after. I can agree, as I always do, and let them strip away another piece of who I am. Or I can find my voice and use it. I look at the gallery invitation still sitting on my kitchen counter, then at the tablet beside it, then at my family who loves me enough to want to solve my problems, but not enough to understand that my paintings aren't problems to be solved. I suppose the story of how I became a woman who paints in her kitchen begins 47 years ago, when James first saw me covered in paint in Professor Harrison's studio class. I was 24, 2 years into my master's program in fine arts, working on a series of cityscapes that captured the way urban light changed throughout the day. Art wasn't just what I studied, it was who I was, the language I spoke most fluently. James used to joke that he fell in love with me because I was the only woman he'd ever met who could disappear completely into a moment. He'd find me in the studio at midnight, completely absorbed in the problem of mixing the exact shade of blue-gray that captured dusk settling over downtown buildings. We married 6 months after graduation. I had a teaching position lined up at Lincoln High School, and James was starting his engineering career with the city planning department. Our first apartment had huge windows and hardwood floors. I turned the spare bedroom into a studio where I painted every evening after school. Those were golden years, teaching teenagers to see the world through artists' eyes all day, then exploring my own vision all night. I remember the exact moment I knew I was pregnant with David. I was working on a painting of the river at sunrise, trying to capture that impossible moment when water becomes mirror becomes light. Suddenly, the smell of turpentine made me nauseous. David arrived during my 3rd year of teaching, and for a while I managed both worlds successfully. James would take the night feeding so I could steal a few hours in my studio. My mother watched David on Saturday mornings so I could attend life drawing sessions downtown. I exhibited in 2 group shows that year, sold 3 paintings, and felt like I was building toward something significant. Then came Sarah 2 years later, and Michael 18 months after that. The studio became a nursery, then a playroom, then just another bedroom as our family expanded. I painted when I could. Quick watercolor sketches during nap time, larger pieces on weekends when James could watch all 3 children. My work grew smaller, faster, more portable. Not by choice, but by necessity. Lisa arrived when I was 32, and by then I'd been away from serious painting for almost 6 years. My hands had lost their confidence with oil paints. My eye had lost its training for complex compositions. I remember standing in the art supply store, holding a tube of cadmium yellow, and realizing I couldn't remember the last time I'd mixed a color just because it was beautiful. James understood what I'd given up, but he also understood that choice wasn't really choice when 4 small people depended on us completely. He'd find me sometimes, late at night, flipping through art magazines with an expression that must have broken his heart. During those years, my artistic identity became something I carried quietly, like a letter tucked away in a drawer, still there, but no longer part of daily life. The accident happened on a Tuesday morning in October. David was 15, Sarah 13, Michael 11, and Lisa 9. James left for work the same way he had every morning for 17 years, kissing each of us goodbye, reminding the older kids about their after-school activities, promising Lisa he'd help her with her science project that evening. The phone call came at 2:47 p.m. while I was picking up Lisa from school. Heart attack while driving. Instantaneous, the doctor said. No suffering. In the space of one phone call, I became a single mother to 4 children with a part-time teacher's salary and a mortgage designed for 2 incomes. The life insurance helped, but not enough. Not nearly enough. I sold James's tools, his boat, his collection of vintage engineering textbooks. I took on extra tutoring work. I sold my good paints, my professional easel, most of my brushes. Art supplies became a luxury I couldn't justify when children needed school clothes and groceries and college savings. The house went on the market 18 months later. David, by then 16 and angry about everything, accused me of giving up too easily. He didn't understand that keeping the house would have meant choosing memory over survival, and I had 3 other children who needed stability more than I needed the room where James had kissed me goodnight for 15 years. We moved to an apartment half the size, in a neighborhood that was safe but not special. I hung 5 of my favorite paintings in the living room and stored the rest in a rented garage space I could barely afford. The children adapted faster than I did. They made friends, joined activities, built new routines that didn't include their father or their mother's artistic ambitions. I learned to paint small again. Watercolors on paper instead of oils on canvas. Subjects I could observe from my kitchen window instead of scenes that required field trips to interesting neighborhoods. I told myself this was temporary, that when the children were older and more independent, I'd return to serious work. But children don't become independent on schedule. David struggled in his senior year and needed intensive tutoring to graduate. Sarah developed anxiety that required therapy and careful attention. Michael broke his leg playing football and needed months of physical therapy. Lisa, my baby, seemed to absorb everyone's stress and developed stomach problems that kept her home from school frequently. By the time all 4 children were genuinely independent, graduated, employed, married, settled, I was 58 years old and hadn't had a real studio in over 20 years. My confidence was gone. My technique was rusty. The art world had moved on without me, embracing styles and technologies I didn't understand. I felt like someone trying to rejoin a conversation that had continued for decades without her. I started again anyway. Small canvases, familiar subjects, techniques I remembered from my youth. I painted the view from my apartment window in different seasons, different times of day. I painted my grandchildren when they visited, trying to capture their energy and innocence. I painted from old photographs of James, trying to hold on to his face as my memory of it began to fade. Slowly, my hands remembered what they knew. My eye regained its training. My heart remembered why art had mattered to me in the first place, not for gallery showings or critical recognition, but for the pure joy of transforming what I saw into something that captured not just appearance, but feeling. David noticed my renewed interest in painting, with the same mixture of affection and concern he'd shown toward all my phases over the years. When I was learning to use a computer at 55, he'd been patient, but slightly amused. When I took a ceramics class at 60, he'd been supportive, but clearly relieved when I didn't continue. My painting, I think, worried him more, because it reminded him of who I'd been before. Tragedy reshaped our family. Linda's reaction was more straightforward. As an interior designer, she saw my paintings through a professional lens. Were they skillful enough to display? Current enough to be impressive? Valuable enough to matter? The answer, in her assessment, was no on all counts. My work looked amateur to her trained eye, dated compared to contemporary styles, excessive in quantity for someone living in a small apartment. I tried not to take her criticism personally. Linda meant well, and her standards were professional rather than personal. But it stung to have 30 years of growth and exploration dismissed as hobby-level dabbling. It hurt to have my return to art, which felt like recovery to me, viewed as evidence of an elderly woman with too much time on her hands. The hardest part was watching my grandchildren inherit their parents' attitude toward my work. When David and Linda visited with the twins, the children would glance at my paintings with polite disinterest, the way they might acknowledge a neighbor's garden. Nice enough, but not relevant to their lives. They'd inherited their grandmother's artistic DNA. I could see it in the way they doodled during family dinners. But they'd also learned that art was something people did as a hobby, not something that mattered. I kept painting anyway, not because my family understood or appreciated it, but because stopping felt like dying a little bit. Each morning when I mixed my first color, I felt like I was choosing life over resignation. Each completed painting proved to myself that I was still here, still seeing, still capable of transformation. Standing in my kitchen now, watching David and Linda evaluate my life's work like items at a garage sale, I realized that this moment has been building for years. Not just their desire to organize my space, but my willingness to let my dreams be managed by people who love me, but don't understand me. The gallery invitation sits 3 feet away, offering me a chance to let strangers judge my work instead of family. For the first time in decades, someone outside my family wants to see what I've created. Someone thinks my paintings might be worth sharing with the world. The day they threw away 30 years of my paintings started like any other Tuesday. I had a routine doctor's appointment. Nothing serious, just the quarterly check-in that becomes necessary when you're 71, and your body occasionally reminds you that it's been working hard for 7 decades. I left my apartment at 9 in the morning, expecting to be home by lunch, perhaps with enough energy left to work on the street scene that had been calling to me all week. Dr. Peterson's office runs efficiently, which I appreciate. At my age, waiting rooms feel less like temporary inconvenience and more like glimpses of time I can't afford to waste. The appointment went well. Blood pressure stable, heart strong, vision still sharp enough for detail work. He asked about my activities, and I mentioned my painting with the pride I'd learned to temper around my family, but never quite managed to suppress completely. He lit up in a way that surprised me. His wife, he said, was a watercolorist, and they'd recently visited a gallery featuring local artists from the 1970s and 80s. Did I know there was renewed interest in that period? Had I ever exhibited my work? When I mentioned the invitation I'd received, he encouraged me strongly to pursue it. In his medical opinion, creative pursuits were the best possible prescription for healthy aging. I drove home feeling lighter than I had in months. Someone believed my work mattered. Someone thought art was medicine, not distraction. I was actually humming as I climbed the stairs to my apartment, mentally planning how I'd photograph my paintings for the gallery submission. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Usually my apartment carries the subtle sounds of life in a building. Neighbors moving around, traffic from the street, the gentle hum of my refrigerator. But this silence felt different, empty. I turned my key in the lock and stepped into a space that looked like my apartment but felt like a stranger's. Everything was clean. Pristinely, aggressively clean. In a way that made my chest tighten with recognition. Linda's organizational sessions always left my space looking like a magazine photo. Beautiful, functional, and completely devoid of personality. But this was different. This was surgical. My easel was gone. The small table where I mixed colors was gone. The paintings that had been stacked against my bedroom wall were gone. 37 canvases that represented 5 years of rediscovering myself as an artist had simply vanished, along with most of my art supplies and all evidence that anyone creative had ever lived in this space. In their place, arranged with Linda's characteristic attention to feng shui, was a complete digital art station. The tablet David had given me was now mounted on a sleek, adjustable stand. A wireless keyboard and stylus sat in a custom organizer. Instruction manuals were arranged in a neat fan pattern beside a beginner's guide to digital painting. Everything was white and silver and perfectly coordinated with my existing furniture. I stood in my living room, holding my doctor's encouragement about the gallery exhibition, staring at the place where my paintings used to live, and felt something crack inside my chest. Not my heart. That kept beating. Something deeper. Some fundamental belief about family, about love, about the right to exist as myself in my own space. The note was propped against the tablet, written in Linda's careful handwriting on her personal stationery. It explained everything: how they'd spent all morning solving my storage problem, how they'd donated most of my paintings to charity where they could bring joy to people who couldn't afford original art, how they'd disposed of canvases that were too damaged or amateur for donation. The digital station was their gift to me, all the benefits of artistic expression without any of the mess, storage issues, or quality concerns. They'd left phone numbers for tech support and information about digital art classes at the senior center. Linda had even researched online communities where beginning digital artists could share their work and receive encouragement. The note ended with assurances that they loved me and wanted to make my life easier and more organized. I read the note 3 times before the words sank in completely. They'd thrown away 30 years of my artistic journey while I was at a doctor's appointment. They'd made a decision about my life, my work, my identity, without consulting me. They'd literally erased evidence of who I was and replaced it with who they thought I should be. The paintings in my bedroom were gone, but I remembered suddenly about the ones in the garage. David rented me a small storage space in the building's basement garage at a family discount. 23 canvases from my earlier work, plus supplies I'd accumulated over the years. I grabbed my keys and ran downstairs faster than I'd moved in years. The garage space was empty, except for a few boxes of Christmas decorations and some old furniture I'd saved from the house James and I had shared. My paintings were gone. My easel was gone. Brushes I'd owned for decades, some still bearing traces of colors I'd mixed years ago. Gone. Even my palette knife, the one James had given me for our 5th anniversary, had disappeared. I sat on an old trunk in that empty garage space and finally understood what I was dealing with. This wasn't spring cleaning or organization or even misguided helpfulness. This was elimination. My family had decided that my identity as an artist was a problem to be solved, and they'd solved it by making it disappear. The fury came in waves. First, the hot anger of violation. How dare they enter my space and destroy my work without permission? Then, the cold anger of dismissal. How could they consider 30 years of creative growth so worthless that it belonged in a dumpster? Finally, the deep anger of recognition. This was who they'd always seen me as. Not an artist who happened to be their mother and grandmother, but a mother and grandmother who had an inconvenient hobby that needed management. I called David from the garage, standing among the empty spaces where my life's work had been stored. His phone went straight to voicemail, so I called Linda. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright with the satisfaction of a job well done. Her reaction to my distress confused her, I could tell. She'd expected gratitude for solving such a complex problem so efficiently. When I asked where my paintings were, she explained patiently that most had gone to Goodwill, though some were beyond salvage and had to be disposed of. When I asked why they hadn't consulted me first, she reminded me that I'd agreed to their help with organizing, and they'd simply been more thorough than usual. The conversation that followed made it clear that my family had genuinely believed they were helping me. In their minds, my paintings were clutter that prevented me from living efficiently in a small space. My attachment to them was sentimental rather than practical. The digital solution would give me all the benefits of art making without any of the inconveniences of traditional media. When I tried to explain what they'd destroyed, Linda's patience began wearing thin. These weren't masterpieces, she pointed out. I wasn't a professional artist. The paintings had been taking up storage space I was paying for, collecting dust in my apartment, creating mess and disorganization. No one was stopping me from making art. They'd given me better tools to do it with. I hung up while she was mid-sentence and sat in that empty garage until the afternoon light began to fade. 30 years of growth, experimentation, discovery, joy, gone. Not stolen by strangers or destroyed by accident, but deliberately eliminated by people who claimed to love me. That evening, I did something I hadn't done since James died. I got in my car and drove to the art supply store downtown. I used money from my small emergency fund to buy basic supplies: a set of acrylic paints, brushes, canvas boards, a simple easel that would fit in my kitchen corner. The young clerk who helped me had paint under her fingernails and that focused intensity I recognized from my own studio days. She asked if I was starting a new project, and I heard myself say something that surprised me. Yes, I'm starting my life over. Back in my apartment, I set up the new easel in the exact spot where my old one had stood. I arranged the fresh supplies on my kitchen table and opened a new tube of cadmium yellow. The smell brought back 40 years of memories. My first oil painting class, late nights in the studio with James reading nearby, teaching David to mix colors when he was 8 and actually interested in what I did. I painted until 3 in the morning, not anything planned or careful, just color and movement, and the physical joy of making marks that meant something to me. When I finally stepped back, I'd created something raw and angry and honest. A painting that looked like starting over feels when you're 71 years old and have nothing left to lose. I realized, as I cleaned my new brushes in the kitchen sink, that my family had unknowingly given me something valuable. They'd forced me to confront a choice I'd been avoiding for years: continue accepting their version of who I was, or reclaim my own. The gallery invitation was still sitting on my counter, next to the digital art station I would never use. In 6 weeks, I could submit 15 paintings to an exhibition that might help other people see what my family never would. I had 6 weeks to rebuild a portfolio, 6 weeks to prove to myself that the artist in me had survived 30 years of compromise and 1 morning of elimination. I looked at the painting I'd just finished, imperfect, immediate, alive, and felt something I hadn't felt in not just anger at what had been taken from me, but excitement about what I might still create. The card arrived 3 days after I'd restocked my art supplies, and its timing felt like the universe's way of confirming that some decisions make themselves. I was cleaning my brushes after a morning painting session when I heard the mail slot open and the familiar thud of letters hitting my hallway floor. Among the usual bills and advertisements was a business envelope with Riverside Community Gallery embossed in elegant script across the corner. Sarah Martinez had included her business card with a handwritten note on the back. I never forgot your urban landscapes class. Would love to discuss the exhibition over coffee if you're interested. My number hasn't changed since high school. Below that, she'd added what felt like a lifeline. I've seen your recent work and think you're exactly what this show needs. I stared at that last sentence until the words blurred. How had she seen my recent work? I hadn't exhibited anything in over 20 years. Hadn't shared my paintings with anyone except my family, who'd just demonstrated exactly what they thought of them. For a moment, I wondered if this was some kind of mistake, a case of mistaken identity, or confused records. But then I remembered Mrs. Henderson from 4B, who'd asked to buy the small watercolor I'd painted of our building's courtyard garden, and Tom at the grocery store, who'd commissioned a painting of his late wife's rose garden for their anniversary, and the quiet woman at the coffee shop who'd seen me sketching and asked if I did portraits. Over the past few years, without really thinking of it as showing my work, I'd been sharing my art with people who appreciated it for what it was, rather than judging it for what it wasn't. I called Sarah that afternoon, my hands shaking slightly as I dialed. Her voice was warm and professional, and I could hear the confident woman she'd become underneath the teenager I remember. She wanted to meet at the gallery the next day to discuss the exhibition and see what work I had available. The conversation that followed changed everything. Sarah had become a curator and gallery owner, specializing in what she called overlooked artists, people whose work had been dismissed or ignored because it didn't fit current market trends or because the artists themselves had been marginalized. The exhibition was designed to challenge assumptions about artistic value and to celebrate work that might otherwise disappear. When I explained my recent storage situation, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking with barely controlled anger. She'd seen this before, she said. Family members who disposed of elderly artists' work without understanding its value. In her professional opinion, it was a form of cultural destruction that happened far too often to document. Then she asked a question that made my heart skip. What if I told you some of your paintings aren't actually gone? The story she told me over the next 20 minutes sounded like something from a movie. A volunteer at Goodwill, an art student named Marcus, who worked part-time sorting donations, had recognized the quality of a batch of paintings that had come in earlier that week. Instead of putting them out for sale immediately, he'd contacted his professor, who'd contacted Sarah, who'd recognized my signature from the research she'd been doing for the exhibition. 17 of my paintings were currently in Sarah's gallery, waiting for me to reclaim them. The other 20 had already sold to collectors who specialized in rediscovered work. The prices they'd commanded were more than my teacher's pension provided in 6 months. I sat in my kitchen, holding the phone and staring at the digital art station my family had provided, trying to process what Sarah was telling me. People I'd never met had valued my work enough to pay significant money for it. Professionals in the art world saw something in my paintings that my own family had considered worthless. When I finally found my voice, I asked the question that had been haunting me since Tuesday. How did they get the right to throw away my work? Sarah's answer was swift and definitive. They didn't. As the creator and owner of the paintings, I was the only person legally authorized to dispose of them. What my family had done was technically theft, and I had every right to pursue legal action. She put me in touch with Marcus, the student who'd rescued my paintings. His voice was young and passionate when he called that evening, filled with the kind of artistic enthusiasm I remembered from my teaching days. He'd been following my work since discovering it at the donation center, researching my background and previous exhibitions. To him, I wasn't a grandmother who painted as a hobby. I was an artist whose career had been interrupted by life, but whose vision had continued developing. Marcus offered to help me document what had been lost and to assist with photographing my remaining work for the gallery submission. More importantly, he offered something I hadn't realized I needed: validation from someone whose artistic judgment wasn't clouded by family dynamics or generational assumptions. Our first meeting took place at my apartment the following Saturday. Marcus arrived with professional photography equipment and an infectious enthusiasm that reminded me why I'd loved teaching. He examined each of my recovered paintings with the serious attention of someone who understood artistic process, asking questions about technique and evolution that my family had never thought to ask. As he photographed my work, he talked about what he saw: the development of my color sense over the years, the way my compositions had grown more confident, the distinctive quality of light in my urban scene. His commentary was both technical and emotional, the kind of artistic conversation I'd been starving for without realizing it. When I showed him the painting I'd completed after the cleaning incident, his reaction was immediate and strong. "This is your best work," he said without hesitation. "This is what pain transformed into power looks like." He wanted to include it in the exhibition, alongside my earlier pieces, to show the full arc of my artistic journey. Through Marcus, I met other members of what he called the rediscovery community: artists, students, and collectors who specialized in finding and promoting overlooked. They introduced me to legal resources for artists whose work had been wrongfully disposed of, and to organizations that advocated for elderly artists' rights. I learned that my situation wasn't unique. Across the country, thousands of elderly artists lose their life's work to family members who view art as clutter rather than legacy. Most never pursue legal action because they don't know their rights, or because family relationships feel more important than artistic justice. But the cost isn't just personal. Entire artistic legacies disappear, taking with them unique voices and perspectives that can never be recovered. Sarah scheduled a consultation with an attorney who specialized in artists' rights. Her name was Patricia Wong, and she'd handled several cases involving wrongful disposal of artwork. The consultation was free, she assured me, and even if I decided not to pursue legal action, I'd understand my options. The week between making that appointment and keeping it felt like the longest of my life. I painted every day, driven by a creative energy I hadn't felt in years. Each morning brought new possibilities, new ways of seeing, new techniques to explore. I was painting larger again, with more confidence and less concern about who might approve or disapprove of the results. David called twice during that week, both times to ask how I was adjusting to my new digital art setup. Each conversation was polite but tense, with him clearly expecting gratitude for the solution they'd provided, and me struggling to find words for feelings I was still processing. Linda sent a text message with links to online tutorials for digital painting, along with cheerful emojis that felt like salt in a wound I was just beginning to understand. I didn't tell them about the gallery exhibition, or the rescued paintings, or the legal consultation. Some instinct warned me that sharing this information before I was ready would lead to attempts to manage this situation, the way they'd managed my art supplies. For the first time in years, I was making decisions about my life without seeking family approval or avoiding family disapproval. The night before my appointment with Patricia Wong, I stood in my kitchen looking at the 17 paintings Sarah had rescued from Goodwill. They represented different periods of my artistic development. Early attempts to recapture skills I'd lost during the child-rearing years, middle period explorations of color and light, recent work that showed increasing confidence and sophistication. Together, they told the story of a woman who'd never stopped being an artist, even when circumstances forced her art into corners and compromises. They proved that 30 years of painting in kitchens and spare bedrooms hadn't been wasted time or amateur dabbling. They were evidence of persistence, growth, and the kind of authentic artistic vision that can't be taught or faked. I realized, as I prepared for sleep, that I was no longer the woman who'd agreed to let her family organize her life. That woman had believed her art was a burden to be managed, a hobby that inconvenienced the people she loved. The woman I was becoming understood that her art was part of her identity, worthy of protection and respect. Tomorrow, I would learn about my legal rights. Next week, I would submit my work to the gallery exhibition, and at some point soon, I would have to decide what kind of relationship I could have with a family that had demonstrated such fundamental misunderstanding of who I was. But tonight, I was an artist surrounded by her work, planning her comeback at 71, ready to fight for the right to exist as herself in a world that preferred elderly women to be convenient rather than creative. Patricia Wong's office overlooked the river, with floor-to-ceiling windows that filled the space with the kind of natural light I'd spent decades chasing in my paintings. She was younger than I'd expected, perhaps 45, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a sleek bun, and the focused intensity of someone who'd built her career fighting battles other people were afraid to take on. Her first question caught me off guard. "Mrs. Chen, before we discuss legal remedies, I need to understand what you want to achieve. Is this about recovering financial losses, establishing boundaries with your family, or something else entirely?" I'd spent 3 days preparing for questions about evidence and documentation, but no one had asked me what I actually wanted. The question forced me to examine motivations I'd been afraid to acknowledge, even to myself. What I wanted, I realized as I sat in her bright office, was simple and complicated at the same time. I wanted my family to understand that they'd hurt me. I wanted assurance that my remaining work would be safe from future organizing sessions. I wanted the right to be an artist in my own home without justification or apology. And yes, I wanted some kind of acknowledgement that destroying 30 years of creative work was wrong, regardless of their intentions. Patricia listened without interruption as I explained the situation, occasionally taking notes, but mostly just watching my face with the keen attention of someone trained to hear what clients weren't saying aloud. "You have several legal options," she said, pulling out a folder thick with similar cases. "But before we explore those, I want you to understand something important. Legal action changes family relationships permanently. Even when families reconcile afterward, there's always a before and after. Are you prepared for that possibility?" The question made my stomach clench. David was my firstborn, the child who'd held my hand through James's funeral, who'd helped me navigate single parenthood when I felt completely overwhelmed. Linda was the daughter-in-law who'd organized my surprise 70th birthday party, who'd driven me to medical appointments when I was too nervous to drive myself. Whatever their faults, they were my family. But they were also the people who'd decided my artistic identity was disposable, who'd made major decisions about my life without consulting me, who'd demonstrated, in the most concrete way possible, that they valued their convenience over my autonomy. Patricia outlined my options with clinical precision. I could pursue a civil claim for destruction of property, which might result in financial compensation for the lost paintings. I could file a report for theft, since they'd taken items from my storage space without permission. I could demand return of any remaining pieces that hadn't yet been sold. Or I could use the threat of legal action to negotiate boundaries that would prevent future incidents. Each option had advantages and risks. Legal action would establish my rights clearly, but might destroy family relationships. Negotiation might preserve relationships, but could be seen as weakness, inviting future boundary violations. Doing nothing would avoid conflict, but would essentially give my family permission to continue managing my life according to their preferences. As Patricia explained the complexities, I found myself thinking about a painting I'd started that morning, a portrait of the courthouse steps where James and I had gotten married 46 years ago. The building had been renovated since then, updated with modern accessibility features and fresh stone facing, but the essential structure remained. I realized my situation was similar. I could update my relationships with modern boundaries and fresh understanding, but I needed to decide whether the essential structure was worth preserving. I asked for time to consider my options, and Patricia agreed to hold off on any action while I made my decision. But she did offer one immediate suggestion: document everything I could remember about the destroyed work, including photographs if I had them, dates of completion, materials used, size and subject matter. Even if I never pursued legal action, the documentation might be useful for insurance purposes or for establishing the scope of my artistic output. That assignment sent me diving into boxes I hadn't opened in years. I'd been more systematic about documenting my work than I'd realized. I had sketches for most of the destroyed paintings, photographs of several pieces I'd given as gifts, even a small notebook where I'd recorded which colors I'd mixed for specific effects. The process of reconstruction was painful, but also illuminating. I'd created far more work than I'd given myself credit for. Sarah stopped by that evening to check on my progress with the gallery submission. She brought Chinese takeout and a bottle of wine, treating our meeting more like a collaboration between colleagues than a consultation between professional and amateur. As we spread my documentation across my kitchen table, she helped me see patterns in my artistic development that I'd been too close to recognize. My work had evolved in waves, she pointed out, with each period showing increased sophistication and confidence. My color sense had grown more subtle over time, my compositions more complex. The paintings I'd completed in the past 5 years showed mastery of technique combined with emotional depth that only came from lived experience. "You're not an amateur who's been painting for decades," she said, studying a photograph of a cityscape I'd completed 2 years ago. "You're a professional artist who was forced to work in isolation. There's a difference, and people in the art world recognize it." She wanted to feature my story as part of the exhibition's narrative, not as tragedy, but as testament to artistic persistence under difficult circumstances. The show would include a timeline of my work alongside pieces from other rediscovered artists, demonstrating how creativity continues even when it's not commercially supported or socially validated. The idea of my story being public made me nervous. I'd spent so many years minimizing my artistic identity that the thought of claiming it publicly felt presumptuous. But Sarah's confidence was infectious, and Marcus's enthusiasm when he joined us later that evening helped convince me that my experience might help other artists in similar situations. As they helped me select pieces for the exhibition, I realized I was having the kind of artistic conversation I'd missed for decades. We talked about the relationship between color and emotion, about how personal experience informs artistic vision, about the difference between technical skill and authentic voice. These were the discussions I'd once had with fellow art students, conversations that had fed my creative soul before life redirected my attention to more practical concerns. David called while Marcus was photographing my latest painting. I stepped into the hallway to answer, not ready to explain why there were strangers in my apartment, or why I was working on new art instead of learning the digital system they'd provided. His voice carried the false cheer he used when he was trying to manage my mood. "Linda had found some wonderful online communities for senior digital artists," he said. "They'd even signed me up for a virtual class that started next week." Wasn't that exciting? I listened to his plans for my artistic future and felt the distance between us stretching like a canyon. He was talking about the woman he wanted me to be, grateful, manageable, safely contained within acceptable boundaries. But I was becoming someone else entirely, someone who valued her own vision enough to fight for it. When I returned to the kitchen, Sarah and Marcus were discussing price ranges for the exhibition. The numbers they mentioned were higher than I'd expected, based on recent sales of similar, rediscovered work. If even half my pieces sold, I'd have enough money to rent a proper studio space, to buy professional equipment, to live like the artist I was becoming rather than the hobbyist my family assumed I was. That possibility, financial independence through my art, changed everything. It wasn't just about validation or recognition anymore. It was about autonomy, the ability to make decisions about my life based on my values rather than other people's convenience. I made my decision that night, sitting in my kitchen with exhibition forms spread across the table and my latest painting drying on its easel. I would submit my work to the gallery show. I would document my losses and consult with Patricia about legal options. And I would tell my family exactly what they'd done and how I planned to respond. But first, I would paint. I would spend the next month creating the strongest work I was capable of. building a portfolio that represented not just my artistic growth, but my personal transformation. When the exhibition opened, I would stand beside my paintings as the artist I'd always been, but had been afraid to claim. I called Patricia the next morning and scheduled a follow-up appointment. I wanted to explore all my legal options, not necessarily to pursue them immediately, but to understand my rights and choices. Knowledge was power, and I'd spent too many years making decisions from a position of ignorance about what was possible. The woman who'd allowed her family to dispose of her life's work was disappearing, replaced by someone who understood her own value and was prepared to defend it. The process was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, like stepping off solid ground into space and discovering I could fly. The Riverside Community Gallery occupied a converted warehouse in the Arts District, with exposed brick walls and soaring ceilings that made even small paintings feel monumental. Sarah gave me a tour the day I submitted my work, showing me where my pieces would hang and introducing me to the team that would help bring the exhibition to life. I felt like I was entering a foreign country where my passport was finally valid. Everyone spoke the language I'd been denied for decades. Conversations about artistic vision, creative process, the relationship between personal experience and universal truth. No one asked if my painting was just a hobby or suggested I might prefer a less messy medium. The other featured artists were people like me, artists whose careers had been interrupted by circumstance, but whose vision had continued developing despite external challenges. There was Robert, 78, who'd returned to sculpting after retiring from his job as a mail carrier. Elena, 69, had started painting seriously again after her husband's death ended 40 years of marriage to a man who'd considered art a waste of time. James, different James from my late husband, was 82 and had been creating collages in secret for decades because his family thought artistic pursuits were undignified for a retired banker. Meeting them was like finding a tribe I'd never known existed. We shared stories of painting and hiding, of minimizing our work to avoid family disapproval, of the particular pain that comes from having your creative identity dismissed by people who claim to love you. But we also shared something more powerful, the absolute certainty that our work mattered, regardless of who else understood its value. Elena became my closest ally in the group. Like me, she'd lost significant work to family cleaning, and like me, she was struggling with how to rebuild those relationships after such a fundamental violation of trust. We met for coffee twice a week, officially to plan for the exhibition, but really to give each other permission to feel angry about what had been taken from us. "People think we should be grateful for any attention from our families," she said during one of our conversations. "They don't understand that dismissive attention is worse than benign neglect. At least neglect doesn't actively erase who you are." Through Elena, I learned about legal advocacy organizations for elderly artists, support groups for people whose families had disposed of their work without permission, and financial resources for artists rebuilding their careers later in life. I discovered that my situation wasn't rare. It was an epidemic of cultural destruction that happened quietly in homes across the country, leaving no headlines but destroying irreplaceable artistic legacies. More importantly, Elena introduced me to the concept of artistic chosen family, the idea that creative people often find their deepest understanding and support from other artists rather than blood relatives. This wasn't about rejecting family entirely, she explained, but about building a support network that recognized and nurtured the artist inside me. Marcus became part of that chosen family, along with several of Sarah's other artists. They included me in their Friday evening gatherings at a coffee shop near the gallery, where we'd discuss everything from technical challenges to the emotional aspects of creating work that came from authentic personal vision. For the first time in decades, I was part of a community where my artistic identity was primary rather than peripheral. These friendships fed my creative energy in ways I'd forgotten were possible. I was painting with new confidence, tackling larger canvases and more complex compositions. The work I created during those weeks was stronger than anything I'd done in years, not just technically, but emotionally. I was painting from a place of power rather than apology, creating work that claimed space rather than asking permission to exist. The transformation wasn't just artistic. I found myself standing straighter, speaking more directly, making decisions based on my own judgment rather than constantly calculating other people's reactions. When the grocery store clerk admired the small watercolor sketches I'd started carrying in my purse, I didn't minimize the work or deflect the compliment. When my neighbor asked about commissioning a painting, I quoted a fair price without apologizing for it. David noticed the changes during one of his weekly check-in calls. I sounded different, he said. More confident, maybe even a little distant. Was I feeling all right? Was I adjusting well to the digital art system? When I mentioned that I was working on new paintings, there was a long pause before he asked where I was getting art supplies and where I was storing the new work. The question in his voice, suspicion mixed with concern, made it clear that he viewed my return to traditional art as backsliding rather than growth. In his mind, they'd solved my storage and mess problems, and my insistence on recreating those problems suggested I wasn't thinking clearly. I decided it was time for honesty. I told him about the gallery exhibition, about the rescued paintings, about the legal consultation. I explained that throwing away my work without permission had hurt me deeply, and that I was exploring ways to ensure it never happened again. His reaction was swift and defensive. "They'd been trying to help me," he said. My apartment had been cluttered and disorganized. The paintings hadn't been displayed or cared for properly. How was he supposed to know I was serious about them when I'd never mentioned exhibitions or sales before? The conversation that followed revealed the fundamental disconnect between us. David saw my art as a pastime that had gotten out of hand, like a collection that had grown too large for its space. He couldn't understand why I was making such a big deal about something that had been just sitting around collecting dust. When I tried to explain that those paintings represented 30 years of creative growth, he suggested I was being overly sentimental about what were essentially practice pieces. Linda joined the conversation when David called her over, and her response was more sophisticated but equally dismissive. As a professional designer, she understood artistic value better than David, but she also had strong opinions about what constituted legitimate art. My work, in her assessment, was amateur by professional standards, pleasant enough for personal enjoyment, but not significant enough to warrant the drama I was creating. The suggestion that I might pursue legal action triggered their full attention. Suddenly, I wasn't just being overly sentimental. I was being manipulated by people who didn't understand family dynamics. Sarah was probably inflating the value of my work to make herself feel important. The lawyer was just looking for billable hours. Did I really want to damage our family relationships over some old paintings? I hung up feeling both devastated and liberated. Devastated because their response confirmed my worst fears about how they saw me. Liberated because I no longer had to pretend their dismissal didn't hurt, or that their opinion of my work was objective truth. Elena found me crying in the gallery the next day, where I'd gone to escape my apartment and think about next steps. She listened to my account of the conversation without trying to fix anything or offer silver lining observations. When I finished, she said something that changed my perspective entirely. "You know what this means? It means you're free to become who you actually are instead of who they need you to be. That's terrifying, but it's also the greatest gift they could have given you." She was right. As long as I'd been trying to maintain family harmony while secretly nurturing my artistic identity, I'd been living a compromise that satisfied no one. Their rejection of my art, while painful, also removed the burden of trying to be two different people, the accommodating mother and grandmother they wanted, and the serious artist I was becoming. The exhibition was 3 weeks away. I had work to finish, statements to write, decisions to make about how publicly I wanted to tell my story. I had to decide whether to invite my family to the opening, knowing they might attend out of obligation, but would likely view my artistic celebration as evidence of how seriously I was overreacting to their helpful intervention. But I also had something I'd never had before, a community of people who understood that art wasn't decoration or therapy or hobby. It was identity, vision, the truest expression of who I was. They saw my work the way I'd always hoped my family would see it, and their recognition was healing wounds I'd carried for decades. Standing in the gallery that afternoon, looking at the wall where my paintings would soon hang alongside work by other artists who'd refused to let circumstance defeat their vision, I felt something I hadn't felt since James died. The absolute certainty that I was exactly where I belonged. Patricia Wong's second-floor law office had become familiar territory over the past 2 weeks. The river view that had initially distracted me now felt comforting, a reminder that life flows forward even when individual moments feel overwhelming. Today, she'd asked me to bring all the documentation I'd assembled about my lost work, along with any evidence I had of the disposal without my consent. The folder I carried was surprisingly thick. Beyond the photographs and sketches I'd found in my own boxes, Marcus had helped me gather additional evidence. He'd taken pictures of similar work by me that had been sold from the donation center, providing examples of the quality and style of what had been destroyed. Sarah had written a professional assessment of my artistic development and the significance of losing 30 years of work. Elena had connected me with other artists who'd faced similar situations, providing context for what Patricia called a pattern of cultural dismissal. Patricia reviewed everything with the methodical attention I'd come to appreciate. She didn't dismiss my feelings or minimize the violation I'd experienced, but she also didn't promise outcomes I wanted to hear. Legal action was about establishing principles and protecting future interests, she explained, not about healing family relationships or forcing people to understand things they were determined not to see. Based on what you've shown me, she said after reviewing my documentation, you have a strong case for conversion, the legal term for wrongful disposal of someone else's property. The fact that they removed items from your rental storage space makes it even clearer that they exceeded any implied permission you might have given for organizing your apartment. The financial damages alone were significant. Using Marcus's research and Sarah's professional assessment, Patricia estimated that the destroyed work had a fair market value between $25,000 and $40,000. That was enough to justify serious legal action, but more importantly, it was enough to establish that my family had destroyed something of genuine monetary worth, not just sentimental value. But Patricia wanted me to think beyond financial recovery. What do you want your relationship with your family to look like going forward? She asked. Legal action is a tool, but you need to be clear about what you're trying to build or rebuild. The question forced me to examine assumptions I'd been carrying without realizing it. I'd been thinking about legal action as a way to make my family understand the gravity of what they'd done, to force them to acknowledge my artistic identity and respect my autonomy. But Patricia was right. Law could establish boundaries and compensation, but it couldn't create understanding or respect where none existed. What I wanted, I realized, was the right to exist as myself in my relationships with them, not to be managed or fixed or improved, but to be accepted as a 71-year-old woman who was also a serious artist. I wanted assurance that my remaining work would be safe, that my living space would remain under my control, that future decisions about my life would be made by me. Patricia outlined several approaches we could take. A formal demand letter would establish my legal position without filing suit, giving my family an opportunity to acknowledge wrongdoing and negotiate a resolution. If they responded defensively or dismissively, we could escalate to actual litigation. Alternatively, we could file a police report for theft and let the criminal justice system address the violation, though that approach offered less control over The demand letter appealed to me because it created space for my family to respond thoughtfully rather than defensively. Patricia would draft a document that clearly explained their legal liability while offering a path toward resolution that preserved family relationships if they were willing to accept accountability. As she explained the process, I felt something shift inside me. For the first time since the cleaning incident, I wasn't just reacting to what had been done to me. I was taking action to protect myself and establish terms for future interactions. The difference felt profound, like the moment in a chess game when you stop playing defense and start planning your own strategy. Patricia scheduled our follow-up meeting for the week after the gallery exhibition. That timing felt symbolic. I would face my family's reaction to my legal demands from a position of artistic strength, surrounded by public recognition of work they'd considered worth. I left her office feeling lighter than I had in weeks, not because legal action would solve everything, but because I finally understood my rights and options. Knowledge, I was learning, was its own form of power. Sarah was waiting for me at the coffee shop across from Patricia's building, having offered to debrief whatever I learned from my legal consultation. Over the past month, she'd become not just my curator, but my advocate, someone who understood the intersection between artistic identity and personal autonomy in ways my family never had. When I explained Patricia's recommendations, Sarah's response was immediate and strong. Good. It's about time someone held them accountable for cultural vandalism. Her anger on my behalf felt validating in a way that surprised me. For so long, I'd been the only one who thought what happened to my paintings mattered. Having witnesses to the violation made it feel real rather than just my oversensitive reaction. Sarah had news of her own. The early response to exhibition publicity had been stronger than expected, with several art collectors already asking about purchasing my work. More significantly, a regional arts magazine wanted to interview me about artistic persistence and late-life creativity. My story was becoming part of a larger conversation about ageism in the art world and the value of work created outside traditional career structures. The interview opportunity thrilled and terrified me in equal measure. For decades, I'd minimized my artistic identity to avoid conflict with my family's expectations. Now strangers were asking me to claim that identity publicly, to speak with authority about subjects I'd never been allowed to discuss openly. "You're ready for this," Sarah said when I voiced my concerns. "You've been thinking about these issues for decades. You just haven't had permission to voice your thoughts. Now you're giving yourself that permission." She was right. During my years of painting in kitchen corners and spare bedrooms, I'd developed strong opinions about art education, about the relationship between creativity and aging, about the social forces that prevent people from pursuing authentic self-expression. I'd just never had a platform to share those thoughts or anyone who valued my perspective. The interview was scheduled for the week before the exhibition opening, giving me time to prepare, but not enough time to lose my nerve. Sarah offered to practice with me, helping me articulate ideas I'd been carrying privately for years. That evening, I called Elena to share my legal and professional updates. Her reaction was similar to Sarah's, enthusiasm mixed with recognition that I was entering a phase of my life that would be fundamentally different from everything that had come before. "You know what you're doing?" she said. "You're modeling something important. You're showing that it's never too late to stop accepting other people's limitations and start living from your own truth." Elena had reached her own resolution with her family situation. After months of attempted reconciliation, she decided to maintain minimal contact with relatives who couldn't accept her artistic identity while investing her emotional energy in relationships that supported her growth. "It was lonely sometimes," she admitted, "but it was also peaceful in a way she'd never experienced." Her example helped me understand that I wasn't trying to punish my family or cut them out of my life entirely. I was trying to establish terms under which we could maintain a relationship that didn't require me to diminish myself. If they could accept those terms, wonderful. If they couldn't, I was preparing to build a life that didn't depend on their approval. I spent that evening writing in the journal I'd started keeping since the cleaning incident. The process of documenting my thoughts and feelings had become as important as my painting practice, helping me track my emotional evolution alongside my artistic development. Looking back over entries from just a month ago, I could see how much had changed. The woman who'd stood in her empty garage, devastated by her family's dismissal, was being replaced by someone who understood her own value and was prepared to defend it. The transformation wasn't complete. I still felt anxious about the confrontations ahead, but the direction was clear. I was becoming someone who said yes to opportunities that honored my artistic identity and no to demands that required me to minimize it. Someone who valued her own judgment about her work more than other people's convenience. Someone who understood that love without respect was just another form of control. The gallery exhibition was 10 days away. The legal demand letter would be sent the week after. I had work to finish, statements to write, decisions to make about how much of my story I was willing to share publicly. But tonight, I was an artist preparing for her first solo exhibition in over 20 years, supported by a community that valued her work and a legal team that would protect her rights. the woman who'd painted in secret for decades, was finally ready to step into the light. The morning of the exhibition opening, I woke before dawn with the kind of nervous energy I hadn't felt since my children were born. Pure anticipation mixed with terror, the knowledge that everything was about to change, but uncertainty about whether the change would be positive or devastating. I'd been preparing for this day for 6 weeks, but nothing had prepared me for the reality of seeing my name on the gallery announcement, or the way my stomach dropped when I read the exhibition description that positioned me as a rediscovered artist whose work demonstrates the persistence of creative vision despite decades of cultural dismissal. Sarah had asked me to arrive 2 hours before the public opening to do final checks on the installation and speak with the journalist who was covering the exhibition for the Arts Weekly. I dressed carefully, not in the muted colors I usually wore to avoid drawing attention, but in the deep blue dress I'd bought specifically for this occasion. If I was going to claim my identity as an artist publicly, I wanted to look like someone who belonged in that role. The gallery transformation was breathtaking. My 17 recovered paintings hung alongside the 23 new pieces I'd created in the past 6 weeks, displayed with museum-quality lighting and professional labels that included not just titles and dates, but brief explanations of technique and artistic evolution. Sarah had arranged them chronologically, creating a visual narrative of artistic development that made my growth over 3 decades unmistakable. Standing in front of my work displayed this way felt surreal. These were the same paintings my family had considered clutter, but in this context, they looked significant, purposeful, worthy of serious attention. The professional presentation didn't change the work itself, but it changed how I felt about the work, and more importantly, how I felt about myself as the person who'd created it. Elena arrived while I was still absorbing the installation. She'd become my closest friend during the exhibition preparation, and her presence felt like essential moral support for whatever was about to happen. We walked through the show together, and she pointed out details I'd been too nervous to notice. The way Sarah had grouped my urban landscapes to show the evolution of my color sense. The strategic placement of my most recent pieces, where they'd be the first thing visitors saw when entering the gallery. "Look at this," Elena said, stopping in front of the painting I'd completed the night after my family had thrown away my work. "Look at how powerful this is. This isn't the work of someone who should be grateful for a tablet and digital art classes. This is the work of someone who had something important to say and found a way to say it." The journalist arrived as we were finishing our walkthrough. Janet Morrison was younger than I'd expected, perhaps 40, with the focused intensity of someone who took her subject seriously. She'd done her research, asking specific questions about my artistic development, my experience as an older artist in a youth-oriented field, and the circumstances that had led to this exhibition. I'd been nervous about discussing my family situation publicly, but Janet's questions were thoughtful rather than sensational. She was interested in the broader issues my story represented, how society dismisses older artists, especially women, and how family dynamics can either support or suppress creative identity. My situation was compelling to her because it illustrated patterns she'd observed across multiple interviews with late-career artists. When she asked about the legal action I was pursuing, I found myself speaking with more confidence than I'd expected. This wasn't just about my hurt feelings, I explained, but about establishing that destroying someone's artistic work without permission had consequences. Too many elderly artists lost their life's work to family members who considered it worthless, and the silence around these losses perpetuated the idea that older people's creative output didn't matter. Janet's final question surprised me. What would you say to other older adults who've been told their artistic interests are just hobbies or inconvenient clutter? My answer came without hesitation. I'd say that no one else gets to decide what matters to you. If creating something makes you feel more like yourself, then it's not a hobby. It's essential. And if the people around you can't understand that, find people who can. As Janet packed up her recording equipment, I realized I'd just given my first interview as a professional artist, not as someone's mother or grandmother who happened to paint, but as an artist whose work and opinions were worth documenting. The shift in identity felt monumental, like stepping across a threshold I could never uncross. Sarah arrived as the gallery staff was making final preparations for the opening. She'd invited approximately 50 people, collectors, other artists, gallery supporters, and what she called community influencers, who helped spread word about local artistic events. I'd been thinking of the opening as a small, intimate gathering, but seeing the professional catering setup and the press materials made it clear this was a serious art world event. The first guests arrived exactly at 6 p.m., and I watched from across the room as they moved through the exhibition with the serious attention I'd dreamed of for decades. No one was looking at my work with the polite dismissal I'd grown accustomed to from family gatherings. These were people who understood art, who could read the development and intention behind the work. Marcus appeared at my side with a small group of his fellow art students, all eager to meet the artist whose work they'd been following since the rescue from Goodwill. Their enthusiasm was infectious and genuine. They saw my artistic journey as inspirational rather than pathetic, proof that creative vision could survive decades of practical necessity and social dismissal. The most meaningful moment came when Robert and James, my fellow rediscovered artists, arrived with their families. Their children and grandchildren moved through the exhibition with obvious pride, pointing out their relatives' work to friends and asking informed questions about technique and inspiration. Watching those family interactions, I felt a sharp pang of longing for what I'd hoped my own opening might include. David and Linda arrived at 7:30 during the peak of the evening's activity. I saw them enter and hesitate at the threshold, clearly uncertain about how to navigate an event that positioned me as the artist they'd never acknowledged. They approached me with the careful politeness of people attending a funeral for someone they hadn't known well. Linda examined my work with her professional designer's eye, and I could see her struggling to reconcile her previous assessment of my paintings as amateur with their current context. These were the same pieces she'd considered worthless enough to throw away, but displayed with museum-quality care and attracting serious attention from knowledgeable collectors. David's discomfort was more obvious. He kept checking his phone and making comments about how different everything looked in a gallery setting. When a collector asked him about my artistic background, he deflected with jokes about not understanding art and suggestions that they ask me directly. The conversation I'd been dreading happened near the end of the evening. David cornered me while Linda was examining price lists with barely concealed shock at the values attached to work she'd considered disposal-worthy. "Mom, I need to understand something," he said, his voice tight with the frustration he'd been containing all evening. "If your paintings were worth this much money, why didn't you ever tell us? Why did you let us think they were just hobby things taking up space?" His question revealed the fundamental disconnect between us. He could only understand artistic value in monetary terms, and he'd assumed that if my work had financial worth, I would have mentioned it. The idea that art could have personal value independent of market price was incomprehensible to him. I tried to explain that I'd never painted for money, that the value came from the creative process itself, and from the way art helped me understand my own experience. The financial worth was secondary, meaningful now because it validated my artistic seriousness, but not the reason I'd created the work in the first place. David listened with the expression of someone trying to understand a foreign language. When I finished, he asked the question that summed up our entire relationship. "But if it wasn't worth anything, why are you so upset that we threw it away?" I looked around the gallery, at strangers examining my work with genuine interest, at fellow artists who understood my journey, at press coverage that would help other people in similar situations, and realized that David would never understand what he'd destroyed because he couldn't conceive of value that wasn't quantifiable. "Because it was mine to throw away," I said finally. "Because 30 years of creative work deserves more consideration than garbage, regardless of its monetary worth. Because I deserve to be consulted about major decisions affecting my life." Linda joined us as the evening was winding down, having spent considerable time studying the price lists and sales information. Her approach was more sophisticated than David's, acknowledging that she'd underestimated the professional quality of my work, while still maintaining that their organizing effort had been well-intentioned. When I mentioned the legal consultation, both their faces changed. David's expression shifted to the guarded wariness he used when discussing anything that might cost him money. Linda's became the careful neutrality she employed with difficult clients. They left without making any commitment to attend future exhibitions or to discuss boundaries for future interactions. But they also didn't dismiss my concerns as overreaction or suggest that I was being manipulated by people who didn't understand family dynamic. The gallery setting had given my artistic identity a weight they couldn't easily dismiss, even if they didn't understand or appreciate it. The evening ended with sales beyond Sarah's most optimistic projections. 12 pieces had sold to serious collectors, generating enough income to cover several months of studio rent and professional quality supplies. More importantly, 3 people had commissioned new work, creating the beginning of a sustainable income stream from my art. As Sarah and I walked through the nearly empty gallery at the end of the evening, I felt something I'd never experienced before. The absolute certainty that I was exactly who I was supposed to be. Not the accommodating artist who painted around other people's needs, but the woman who'd claimed her identity publicly and discovered that the world was ready to recognize what her family never could. Patricia Wong's demand letter arrived at David's office on a Wednesday morning, 3 days after the gallery exhibition made local news. I know the timing because he called me within an hour of receiving it, his voice carrying a combination of shock, anger, and what might have been the first genuine respect he'd shown for my decisions in years. The letter was professionally devastating in its clarity. Patricia had documented every aspect of the wrongful disposal with legal precision, establishing not just the monetary value of what had been destroyed, but the legal principles that had been violated. She'd included photographs of similar work that had sold at the exhibition, quotes from art professionals about my artistic significance, and a detailed timeline proving that my family had exceeded any permission I'd given for organizing my space. The financial demand was substantial but fair: $35,000 in damages for destroyed artwork, plus $5,000 in legal fees and costs. But the non-monetary demands were what really got David's attention. Patricia had outlined specific requirements for future interactions: no unauthorized entry to my apartment, no disposal of my belongings without written consent, and no involvement in decisions about my living arrangements or artistic activities without my explicit request. David's phone call was unlike any conversation we'd had in years. For the first time, he wasn't trying to manage my emotions or explain why his actions had been reasonable. He was asking direct questions about what I wanted and whether there was room for negotiation. The newspaper article about the exhibition had shaken him, he admitted. Seeing my story presented as an example of cultural vandalism against elderly artists had forced him to consider his actions from a perspective he'd never imagined. The fact that other people viewed the disposal of my work as newsworthy made it impossible for him to continue dismissing it as family drama. Linda's reaction, when she joined the call, was more complex. As a professional with her own client relationships, she understood the reputational implications of being publicly associated with destroying an artist's work. But she was also genuinely confused about how they'd gone from helping me organize to being portrayed as villains in a legal document. I found myself explaining, with more patience than I'd expected to feel, that their intentions didn't change the impact of their actions. They'd made major decisions about my life without consulting me, destroyed work that represented decades of creative development, and dismissed my distress as overreaction. The fact that they'd meant well didn't repair the damage or prevent future incidents. The conversation that followed was the first honest discussion we'd had about our relationship in years. David acknowledged that he'd always seen my painting as something I did to keep busy, rather than something central to who I was. Linda admitted that her professional training had made her judgmental about work that didn't meet contemporary market standards, without considering its personal significance to me. Neither of them was ready to accept full responsibility for what they'd done, but they were both clearly shaken by the legal and social consequences of actions they'd considered helpful. David asked what it would take to resolve the situation without litigation, and I realized I was finally in a position to establish terms for our relationship, rather than simply accepting whatever they offered. Patricia had prepared me for this moment. She'd outlined several possible resolution scenarios, ranging from full financial compensation to acknowledgement of wrongdoing to agreements about future boundaries. The goal wasn't to punish my family, but to establish that their behavior had consequences and to prevent future violations of my autonomy. I told David I'd consider withdrawing the legal action if they met 3 conditions: written acknowledgement that they'd exceeded their authority and caused significant harm, agreement to respect my autonomy and future decisions about my living space and belongings, and replacement of my destroyed art supplies as a gesture of good faith. The financial compensation was negotiable, I explained, but the principles weren't. I needed assurance that my remaining artwork would be safe, that my apartment would remain under my control, and that future help would be offered rather than imposed. David asked for time to discuss my terms with Linda, and I agreed to a 2-week pause in legal proceedings. Patricia supported this approach, seeing it as an opportunity for my family to demonstrate genuine change rather than just legal compliance. The waiting period gave me time to focus on the opportunities that had emerged from the exhibition. The magazine interview had generated inquiries from other galleries interested in my work. A local art center wanted me to teach workshops on artistic persistence for older adults. 3 collectors had commissioned new pieces, providing income that would support my artistic practice for the next year. Most significantly, I'd been invited to participate in a regional exhibition featuring late-blooming artists, a show that would travel to multiple galleries over the next 18 months. The opportunity would establish my work in a broader art world context and provide exposure I'd never imagined possible. Elena and I celebrated these developments over lunch at our usual cafe near the gallery. She'd watched my transformation over the past 2 months with the satisfaction of someone who'd predicted exactly this outcome from the beginning. "You know what happened," she said as we reviewed my list of new opportunities. "You stopped apologizing for taking up space and started claiming the space you deserved. That's what made everything else possible." She was right. The woman who'd agreed to let her family organize her life had been replaced by someone who understood her own value and was prepared to defend it. The change wasn't just about art. It was about approaching every relationship and opportunity from a position of self-respect rather than self-doubt. Marcus stopped by my apartment that evening to help me plan my workspace for the commissioned pieces. The sales from the exhibition had given me enough money to rent a proper studio, but I'd decided to renovate my current space instead. This apartment had been my sanctuary during the hardest years of single motherhood, and I wanted to honor that history by transforming it into the artist studio it had always been trying to become. We spent the evening measuring walls and planning storage solutions for canvases and supplies. Marcus's enthusiasm for the project reminded me of the joy James used to take in supporting my artistic ambitions. But where James had seen my art as something beautiful I did, Marcus saw it as who I fundamentally was. The difference felt profound. David called on Sunday to schedule a meeting to discuss my terms. His voice carried the careful formality of someone conducting business rather than managing a difficult relative. Linda would be attending, along with their attorney, not to negotiate the substance of my demands, he explained, but to ensure they understood the legal implications of any agreement we reached. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday at Patricia's office. Neutral territory, formal structure, professional mediation. The idea of sitting across a conference table from my oldest son while lawyers documented our family dysfunction felt surreal, but it also felt necessary. I spent the days before the meeting working on the first of my commissioned pieces, a large urban landscape that captured the view from my apartment window at different times of day. The painting was more complex than anything I'd attempted in years, requiring careful planning and sophisticated color mix. But my hands were steady, my vision was clear, and my confidence was absolute. As I painted, I reflected on how much had changed since that Tuesday morning, when I'd returned from the doctor to find my life's work had been eliminated. The woman who'd stood in her empty garage, devastated by her family's dismissal, would never have imagined herself 3 months later, financially independent through her art, legally represented by a respected attorney, preparing to establish formal boundaries with family members who'd finally been forced to take her seriously. The transformation hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt, periods of loneliness, fears about burning bridges with people I loved despite their inability to understand me. But there had also been the profound relief of finally living authentically, the joy of artistic community, the satisfaction of work that mattered beyond its function as time-filling activity. Thursday morning arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that used to make me feel smaller and more vulnerable. But as I dressed for the meeting, in my blue dress again, because it had become my armor, I felt steady and prepared. I wasn't going to my family's table to beg for understanding or acceptance. I was going to establish terms under which we could maintain a relationship that didn't require me to diminish myself. Patricia met me in the lobby of her building, and we rode the elevator to her conference room in comfortable silence. She'd prepared thoroughly for this meeting, with documents and precedents that would support whatever direction our negotiation took. But she'd also reminded me that the most important preparation was emotional, knowing what I needed and being prepared to accept that my family might not be capable of providing. The conference room felt smaller with 6 people around the table, instead of the intimate consultations I'd grown accustomed to during my meetings with Patricia. David sat directly across from me, looking older than I'd noticed before, wearing the dark suit he saved for important business meetings. Linda positioned herself slightly behind him, her designer clothes and perfect posture creating an impression of professional competence that I recognized as her version of armor. Their attorney was a man about David's age who specialized in family law and estate disputes. Patricia had warned me that his presence suggested they were taking the legal implications seriously, which was either very good news or very bad news, depending on how they'd decided to respond to my demand. Patricia opened the meeting by reviewing the facts we'd documented: the unauthorized disposal of my artwork, the exceeded scope of any permission I'd given for organizing my space, and the substantial financial and emotional damage that had resulted. She presented this information without editorializing, letting the chronology speak for itself. David's attorney responded with what Patricia had predicted: acknowledgement that mistakes had been made, but argument that the intent had been helpful rather than harmful. He suggested that a family misunderstanding shouldn't be resolved through legal action when good faith negotiation could address everyone's concerns. Then David surprised me by speaking directly rather than through his lawyer. He'd been thinking about our last conversation, he said, and about the newspaper article that had described his actions as cultural vandalism. The phrase had bothered him because it suggested malicious intent he'd never felt. But he'd also been researching the value of the work that had been destroyed, and the numbers were higher than he'd imagined possible. If I'd told him my paintings were worth tens of thousands of dollars, he said, he would never have disposed of them without consulting me. I felt the familiar frustration of being misunderstood in a fundamental way. David was still thinking in purely financial terms, unable to grasp that the violation would have been equally serious if my work had been worth nothing to anyone but me. But I could also hear something new in his voice: genuine regret rather than defensive justification. Linda's contribution was more sophisticated. She acknowledged that her professional judgment about contemporary art had blinded her to the historical and personal value of my work. She'd evaluated my paintings using current market criteria, without considering their significance as documentation of my artistic development over 3 decades. More importantly, she recognized that they'd made decisions about my life without treating me as the ultimate authority on my own needs and preferences. Even if they'd been right about the practical benefits of digital art tools, she said, they should have discussed the transition with me rather than implementing it as a surprise. Their attorney outlined their proposed resolution: acknowledgement of overreach in a formal letter, replacement of destroyed art supplies with professional quality equivalents, establishment of written protocols for any future assistance with my living arrangements, and financial compensation of $15,000 as recognition that irreplaceable work had been lost. The financial offer was lower than Patricia had demanded, but the other elements addressed my primary concerns about future autonomy. Most importantly, their proposal included language acknowledging that they'd exceeded the scope of implied permission and failed to recognize the artistic and personal significance of the work they'd destroyed. Patricia called for a brief recess so we could discuss their offer privately. In her smaller office down the hall, She explained that their proposal was actually quite strong. Not perfect, but showing genuine recognition of wrongdoing and meaningful change in how they viewed my autonomy. The financial difference wasn't trivial, $20,000 versus $15,000. But Patricia thought we could negotiate that gap. More importantly, she was impressed by their willingness to acknowledge wrongdoing in writing and to establish formal protocols for future interactions. When we returned to the conference room, I found myself speaking directly to David and Linda rather than through our attorneys. The money mattered, I explained, but not as much as assurance that my remaining artwork would be safe and that future decisions about my life would be made by me. I wanted to understand what had changed their perspective, I said. 3 months ago, they'd viewed my distress as overreaction and my artistic identity as inconvenient. What had convinced them to take my concerns seriously? David's answer was honest in a way that surprised me. The newspaper coverage had forced him to consider my situation from an outside perspective, he said. Reading about cultural vandalism against elderly artists had made him realize that other people viewed his actions as newsworthy precisely because they were problematic. But the gallery exhibition had been more impactful than the media coverage. Seeing my work displayed professionally, with serious collectors paying substantial prices for pieces he'd considered worthless, had forced him to recognize that his judgment about artistic value was uninformed rather than objective. Linda's explanation focused on her professional evolution. Working with Patricia's documentation had taught her about artists' rights and the legal protections for creative work. She'd also researched late-career artists and discovered how common family dismissal was, and how devastating it could be to artistic development. Their attorney suggested we finalize the financial terms, so their acknowledgement letter could be drafted with specific details. After brief negotiation, we settled on $18,000 in damages, enough to fund a year of professional studio space and high-quality supplies. More importantly, they agreed to stronger language about future autonomy. The formal agreement would include their commitment to respect Margaret Chen's decisions about her living space, artistic practice, and personal belongings, with specific requirements for written consent before any future assistance with organizing or managing my affairs. As the meeting concluded and documents were scheduled for signing the following week, I felt something I hadn't expected. Genuine hope for rebuilding our relationship on healthier terms. Not the relationship we'd had before, where I'd minimized my needs to avoid conflict, but something new based on mutual respect rather than one-sided accommodation. David lingered after the attorneys had left, clearly wanting to say something that couldn't be included in legal documents. After a moment of awkward silence, he asked if I would be willing to show him my new studio space once I had it set up. Not to offer suggestions or improvements, he clarified, but because he wanted to understand the artistic practice he'd never really seen. The request surprised me because it represented exactly the kind of genuine interest he'd never shown before. I agreed, with the understanding that he was visiting as my guest, rather than as someone with opinions about how I should organize my creative life. Linda's parting comment was equally unexpected. She wondered if I might be interested in collaborating on an article about late-career artists for one of the design magazines she wrote for occasionally. My perspective on artistic persistence despite family and social obstacles would be valuable to readers dealing with similar challenges. I walked out of that conference room feeling like I'd accomplished something unprecedented. I'd established terms for family relationships that honored my autonomy while leaving space for genuine connection. Not the superficial harmony we'd maintained by avoiding difficult topics, but the possibility of relationships based on who I actually was, rather than who they needed me to be. Patricia was pleased with the outcome, both for its legal precedent and for what it demonstrated about negotiating family boundaries. Too often, she said, elderly people accepted poor treatment because they feared losing relationships entirely. My willingness to risk conflict in order to demand respect had created space for healthier connection. The agreement would be signed the following week, and my first commissioned painting was due the week after that. I had legal protection for my artistic practice, financial resources to support my creative work, and the beginning of family relationships that might actually sustain rather then drain my energy. But most importantly, I had something I'd never possessed before: absolute clarity about my own worth and the determination to protect it. The woman who'd painted in kitchen corners to avoid bothering anyone had become someone who claimed space, set boundaries, and expected to be treated with the respect she'd earned through 71 years of growth, sacrifice, and persistence. The studio space I rented was everything my kitchen corner had never been. North-facing windows that provided consistent natural light throughout the day, enough wall space to display work in progress, storage for supplies that didn't require strategic stacking around household appliances. It was the kind of room James had promised to build for me in the house we'd planned to retire in, before life redirected our dreams toward survival rather than fulfillment. I signed the lease on a Thursday and spent the weekend moving my art supplies and recovered paintings into the space. Marcus helped me arrange everything with the careful attention of someone who understood that studio setup wasn't just practical, but psychological. How you organize your creative space reflects how you think about your artistic identity. Elena stopped by on Sunday afternoon to see my progress and help me plan the first workshop I'd been asked to teach at the Community Art Center. Artistic persistence, creativity, across the lifespan was scheduled for the following month, designed for adults who'd abandoned creative pursuits and wanted to restart them. Standing in my new studio, surrounded by work that represented 40 years of artistic development, I felt qualified to teach that class in a way I'd never felt qualified for anything before. Not because I'd achieved conventional artistic success, but because I'd learned something more valuable: how to maintain creative vision despite circumstances that seemed designed to eliminate it. The first commission was challenging in exactly the way I'd hoped professional work would be. My client wanted a large urban landscape that captured the energy of downtown during rush hour, but with the emotional resonance of memory rather than the documentary accuracy of photography. It was the kind of project that required both technical skill and personal vision, exactly what I'd been preparing for during decades of painting in constrained circumstances. Working on commission felt different from painting for myself. There was accountability to someone else's vision while maintaining authenticity to my own perspective. The balance required confidence I'd never quite possessed before, the assurance that my artistic judgment was valuable enough to defend when it conflicted with client expectations. The legal agreement with my family was finalized on a Tuesday that felt anticlimactic compared to the drama that had preceded it. David and Linda arrived at Patricia's office with the professional courtesy of people conducting business, rather than the emotional tension of family crisis. They signed documents acknowledging wrongdoing and committing to respect my autonomy in future interactions. The $18,000 check was substantial enough to fund a year of professional artistic practice, but the formal acknowledgement of harm was more valuable than financial compensation. For the first time in my adult life, I had legal documentation that my artistic work mattered and that destroying it had consequences. David surprised me by asking practical questions about my studio space and commission work, not the managing questions he'd asked before, about costs and storage, and whether I was being realistic, but genuine curiosity about how professional artistic practice worked. It was the kind of conversation I'd imagined having with him for decades, but had never thought was possible. Linda's questions were more sophisticated, reflecting her professional understanding of creative industries. She wanted to know about my relationship with galleries, how pricing worked for commission pieces, whether I was planning to pursue representation by a commercial dealer. Her inquiries treated my artistic career as legitimate rather than questionable, a shift that felt almost as significant as the legal resolution. The newspaper interview about the exhibition had generated responses from other artists facing similar family situations. Sarah forwarded emails from people who'd read my story and recognized their own experiences in it. Some were seeking advice about legal options for wrongfully destroyed work. Others just wanted connection with someone who understood the particular pain of having your creative identity dismissed by people who claim to love you. I found myself becoming an accidental advocate for elderly artists' rights, speaking with journalists about the broader patterns my situation represented. The conversations were emotionally difficult. Each story of destroyed artwork or suppressed creativity felt personal, but they were also empowering. My private trauma was becoming part of a larger conversation about how society treats aging and creativity. The workshops I developed for the Art Center attracted participants whose stories echoed my own. Teachers who'd stopped painting when they retired because their identity as artist had been so tied to their professional role. Retirees whose families considered creative pursuits frivolous compared to productive activities like babysitting grandchildren or managing household tasks. Teaching these workshops reminded me why I'd loved classroom work during my career at Lincoln High School. There's something profound about watching people rediscover creative abilities they'd convinced themselves were gone, or permission to pursue interests they'd been taught to consider selfish. One participant was a 73-year-old former engineer who'd always wanted to try sculpture but had been told it was too messy for someone his age. Another was a 68-year-old grandmother who'd stopped writing poetry when her daughter suggested she focus on more practical volunteer work. Their stories made me realize how widespread the dismissal of elderly creativity was, and how much artistic potential was being lost to social expectations about appropriate aging. Marcus became my unofficial assistant for these workshops, helping participants with technical challenges, while I focused on the emotional aspects of reclaiming creative identity. His enthusiasm for their artistic journeys reminded me daily that age wasn't a barrier to growth. It was often an advantage, providing the life experience and emotional depth that made mature artistic work distinctive. The traveling exhibition invitation arrived 6 weeks after my legal settlement was finalized. Late bloomers, artists who found their voice. After 65s would include work by 12 artists from across the region, each representing a different path toward late-career artistic recognition. My paintings would be featured alongside artists who'd started painting at 70, returned to sculpture after their spouse's death, or overcome family opposition to pursue creative careers. The exhibition would open in 3 different cities over 18 months, providing exposure I'd never imagined possible when I'd been painting in my kitchen corner just months earlier. More importantly, it would position my work within a movement of older adults who refused to accept society's limitations on what was possible at different life stages. Sarah offered to represent me commercially, expanding beyond her gallery's walls to help place my work with collectors and institutions interested in rediscovered artists. The arrangement would provide steady income while allowing me to focus on creating work rather than managing sales. For the first time since James died, I was making enough money from my own skills to live independently without relying on family assistance or concern about financial security. The freedom was intoxicating, not just the ability to buy professional supplies without guilt, but the psychological liberation of supporting myself through work I loved. The community that had formed around my artistic practice continued expanding. Elena and I had coffee twice a week to discuss our respective projects and exhibitions. Marcus introduced me to other artists in their 20s and 30s who were interested in learning from older artists' experiences. Sarah included me in gallery events where I met collectors, curators, and artists whose conversations fed my creative energy. Most importantly, I'd found my voice as an advocate for older adults' right to creative fulfillment. The magazine articles, workshop teaching, and public speaking I was doing weren't distractions from my artistic practice. They were extensions of it, ways of using my platform to help other people claim the creative identities they'd been taught to suppress. David and Linda visited my studio for the first time on a Saturday afternoon in late spring. They moved through the space with the careful attention of people trying to understand something foreign but important. David asked technical questions about my painting process, while Linda examined my work with the professional eye she'd previously used to dismiss it. Their visit wasn't a complete transformation. They still didn't really understand why art mattered to me the way it did. But it represented genuine effort to see me as I actually was, rather than as they needed me to be. Linda even commissioned a small painting for her office, choosing one of my urban landscapes because it reminded her of the neighborhood where she'd grown up. As they prepared to leave, David made a comment that surprised me. "I'm sorry it took so long for us to see what you were doing here. I think Dad would have been proud." It was the first time he'd connected my current artistic practice to the creative identity James had supported and celebrated. The acknowledgement felt like healing for wounds I'd carried for years without fully understanding them. Standing in my studio that evening, surrounded by work in progress and evidence of a career I'd never expected to have at 71, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Complete alignment between who I was and how I was living. Not the accommodation existence I'd maintained for decades, but an authentic life that honored both my relationships and my individual identity. The woman who'd painted in secret to avoid family conflict had become someone who claimed space, set boundaries, and built a community around shared values rather than shared DNA. The transformation hadn't been easy, and there were still moments of sadness about the years I'd lost to others' limitations. But tonight, with commission work drawing on easels and exhibition invitations posted on my bulletin board, I was exactly who I'd always had the potential to become, the artist my 24-year-old self had dreamed of being, informed by the wisdom my 71-year-old self had earned through decades of persistence, compromise, and ultimate refusal to disappear. The Retrospective exhibition opened on a Thursday evening in October, exactly 1 year after the cleaning incident that had changed everything. The gallery had expanded since my first show, taking over the adjacent storefront to create space for what they called the Margaret Chen Collection. 4 decades of urban vision. Sarah had convinced me to display not just my recovered and recent work, but pieces I'd never shown publicly. The small watercolors I'd painted during my children's adolescence, sketches from my teaching years, even the portrait of James I'd worked on during the first anniversary of his death. The complete collection told a story of artistic persistence that even I hadn't fully understood until I saw it arranged chronologically on professional gallery walls. The opening drew a larger crowd than my first exhibition. Art collectors who'd purchased my work brought friends interested in discovering other overlooked artists. Students from the workshops I'd been teaching arrived with family members who'd initially been skeptical about their elderly relatives' creative pursuits. Several members of the Late Bloomers exhibition had traveled to attend, creating an impromptu convention of artists who'd found recognition after age 65. Most significantly, my story had attracted attention from a documentary filmmaker interested in exploring how families either support or suppress creativity in older adults. The camera crew moved discreetly through the opening, capturing conversations that illustrated the themes they were exploring about aging, autonomy, and artistic identity. David and Linda arrived early, before the crowd became overwhelming. They'd asked to see the exhibition privately first, wanting to understand my work without the pressure of social performance. I watched them move through 40 years of my artistic development with expressions that shifted from recognition to surprise, to something that might have been pride. The chronological arrangement made my growth unmistakable. Early pieces showed technical competence, but limited confidence. Work created around the demands of raising 4 children and managing household responsibilities. Middle period paintings demonstrated increasing sophistication despite constraints of time and space. Recent work showed mastery that came not just from skill development, but from the emotional freedom to create authentically. Linda stopped in front of a painting I'd completed during David's senior year of high school, a street scene from our old neighborhood where the light captured late afternoon, in the way that made ordinary moments feel significant. She remembered me working on it, she said, but she'd never really looked at it as art, rather than as evidence of my tendency toward distraction. David's response was more emotional. He found himself drawn to the portrait of James, studying it with the intensity of someone trying to recover memories he'd thought were lost. The painting captured his father not as David remembered him from childhood, but as the man who'd supported my artistic ambitions, even when practical demands made them seem impossible. "I'd forgotten that Dad bought you that easel for your birthday," David said, referring to the painting where James appeared in the background, reading while I worked. "I'd forgotten how much he believed in your art." The comment opened a conversation we'd never had about James's role in our family dynamics. David had inherited his father's engineering mindset and practical focus, but he'd never absorbed James's understanding that creativity wasn't luxury, but necessity for people wired to make meaning through art. As the evening progressed, I found myself moving between two worlds that had finally learned to coexist. My artistic community, Sarah, Marcus, Elena, the other rediscovered artists, celebrated the culmination of a journey they'd supported from the beginning. My family, David, Linda, and my grandchildren who'd driven down from college, tried to reconcile the woman they'd known with the artist whose work surrounded them. The moment that defined the evening came when my granddaughter Emma approached me with obvious nervousness. She'd been accepted to art school, she said, but her parents thought she should pursue something more practical as her major. Could we talk privately about how to manage family expectations while still honoring creative calling? The conversation took place in Sarah's office while the party continued in the main gallery. Emma's situation wasn't identical to mine. She was 18 rather than 71, starting rather than restarting her artistic journey. But the underlying challenge was the same: how to maintain creative identity in families that valued security over self-expression. I shared what I'd learned about the difference between love and support, about the importance of building artistic community outside family structures, about the long-term cost of minimizing creative identity to avoid conflict. But I also encouraged her to approach her parents differently than I'd approached mine, with confidence rather than apology, with clear communication about her goals rather than hoping they'd eventually understand. When we returned to the main gallery, Emma asked David and Linda to join us for a conversation about her artistic ambitions. The discussion that followed was nothing like the conversations I'd attempted with my family over the decades. Emma spoke with clarity about her goals, about the career possibilities in contemporary art, about her willingness to combine artistic practice with practical skills that would ensure financial stability. David and Linda's response was more thoughtful than I'd expected. They asked informed questions about art education and career development, treating Emma's ambitions as serious rather than frivolous. The difference in their approach made me realize how much our legal confrontation and subsequent boundary setting had changed not just our relationship, but their understanding of artistic pursuit as legitimate rather than self-indulgent. The evening concluded with sales that exceeded even Sarah's optimistic projections. The documentary filmmaker scheduled follow-up interviews to explore how family dynamics had evolved after my legal action. 2 galleries in other cities requested traveling versions of the Retrospective. A major art magazine wanted to feature my story in an issue about late-career artistic breakthroughs. But the most meaningful moment came after the crowd had dispersed, when David helped me load unsold paintings into my car with the careful attention of someone handling valuable objects. He asked if I would teach him about art, not to become an artist himself, but to understand what he'd missed about something so central to my identity. The request represented everything I'd hoped for during decades of hiding my artistic practice: genuine interest rather than polite tolerance, recognition that my work was worth understanding rather than simply accommodating. It was too late to recapture the years we'd lost to misunderstanding, but it wasn't too late to build something new based on mutual respect rather than one-sided compromise. Driving home that night, my car filled with paintings that represented 4 decades of creative persistence, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from secret painter to celebrated artist. The transformation hadn't been easy. It had required confronting family dynamics I'd accepted for years, taking legal action against people I loved, and rebuilding my life around principles I'd previously been afraid to defend. But it had also revealed possibilities I'd never imagined at 71. Financial independence through my art, recognition from professionals who understood creative work, community built around shared values rather than shared DNA, family relationships based on who I actually was rather than who others needed me to be. Most importantly, I'd learned that it's never too late to stop accepting other people's limitations and start living from your own truth. The woman who'd painted in kitchen corners to avoid bothering anyone had discovered that claiming space, setting boundaries, and expecting respect didn't destroy relationships. It created the foundation for healthier ones. My phone rang as I was unloading paintings in my studio. It was Elena, calling to celebrate the evening's success and to share news about her own upcoming exhibition. Our conversation lasted an hour, covering everything from technical painting challenges to the psychology of family reconciliation, to plans for collaborative projects that would combine our experiences as artists who'd found recognition later in life. As I prepared for sleep in my apartment that now served as both home and professional studio, I looked at the latest commission drawing on its easel, a large urban landscape that captured the view from my window at dawn, when the light transformed ordinary buildings into something transcendent. It was the same view I'd painted dozens of times over the years, but this version was different. Not because the scene had changed, but because I was seeing it through the eyes of someone who'd finally learned to value her own vision enough to share it with the world. Tomorrow, I would begin work on pieces for the traveling exhibition. Next week, I would teach another workshop for adults reclaiming their creative identities. Next month, I would speak at a conference about artists' rights and family relationships. The calendar that had once been empty, except for doctor's appointments and family obligations, was now filled with opportunities that honored both my artistic ambitions and my desire to help other people find their own creative voices. The forgotten artist had been found, not by strangers who'd discovered her work in a donation center, but by herself, finally willing to claim the identity she'd carried quietly for decades. At 71, I was just beginning the career I'd always been meant to have, informed by the wisdom that comes from persistence, strengthened by the community that forms around authentic self-expression, and supported by family relationships that had been transformed by the radical act of refusing to disappear. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, mixed in with the usual gallery correspondence and workshop inquiries that had become routine parts of my life as a professional artist. The return address made me pause. Lincoln High School Art Department. Inside was an invitation that brought tears to my eyes. The school where I'd taught for 22 years wanted to name their new art studio in honor of my contributions to art education and demonstration of lifelong artistic persistence. The ceremony would include a retrospective of my work in the school's main gallery, with proceeds from sales supporting scholarships for students pursuing art education. The invitation was signed by Sarah Martinez, not the gallery curator who'd rescued my career, but my former student, who'd grown up to become an art teacher herself, and who'd been instrumental in keeping my story alive in educational circles. I called her immediately, and our conversation revealed how my journey had rippled through networks I'd never imagined. Teachers across the region were using my story to encourage students who faced family opposition to their artistic ambitions. Art educators were incorporating discussions about creativity and aging into their curricula, challenging assumptions about when artistic careers begin and end. The studio dedication took place on a Saturday afternoon in May, with an audience that included former colleagues, current students, and dozens of workshop participants who'd driven from other cities to attend. David and Linda were there, along with Emma, who was thriving in her art program and serving as an example to her parents that creative careers could be both meaningful and financially sustainable. But the most moving moment came when a group of my former high school students, now adults in their 40s and 50s, presented me with a portfolio of work they'd created after being inspired by my story to return to artistic pursuits they'd abandoned decades earlier. Standing in the bright, well-equipped studio that bore my name, surrounded by young artists who would benefit from the foundation my journey had helped establish, I felt the profound satisfaction of a life that had found its purpose. The forgotten artist was no longer forgotten, but more importantly, she was no longer alone. She'd become part of a movement of people who refused to accept that creativity expires with youth, who understood that authentic self-expression was worth fighting for at any age, and who were committed to ensuring that future generations of artists would find the support and recognition that had taken her decades to claim. At 73, I was exactly who I'd always had the potential to become, an artist whose work mattered, a teacher whose influence continued expanding, a woman who'd learned that it's never too late to stop apologizing for taking up space and start claiming the life you were meant to live.